Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Ashdown. Thank you very much for giving me your time. You need no introduction. You've been leader of the Liberal Democrats in the 1980s and the 1990s, but also the UK representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, and now you wrote a very interesting and exhilarating new book called Game of Spies. The first question is that how come did you choose to write on this particular topic?
I mean, first of all, it's Paddy. Well, I write books. This is my ninth, and my 2 books ago, I was writing I was asked to write the 70th anniversary of the Great Commando Raid on Bordeaux by 10 Royal Marines, which was the founding event of the unit that I belonged to in the Special Boat Service.
And you won a prize for that one?
I did, yes.
Yes.
I won the
back in 2013.
In that book, I came across these 3 people, and they absolutely fascinated me, and I thought I'd write another book about them. And then they vanished, I forgot about them, and then sometime later somebody rang me up and said, we've just had a box of documents, and they turned out to be the personal papers of one of these 3 people who is called Roger Lands, and he's the secret agent dropped into France, into Bordeaux. And that led me back into the story, and I then uncovered the private documents of the Gestapo officer and was able to write a book which follows these 3 people day by day for 2 years, but from early 1942 to the middle of 1944.
Very interesting. And you got 3 characters. One is from the French resistance, the other one the British intelligence, and the other one from Gestapo. So what are their strengths and weaknesses, and in what ways are they similar?
They're not very similar, any of them, the personalities. The secret agent is French by origin, very focused, very small, very unobtrusive, the kind of man who would vanish in a crowd, but very focused, a soldier basically, who sees his job as carrying out his orders, and who is very conscious about betrayal and very, very determined to keep safe through security, a professional, in many ways I don't think he was a very nice man in many ways, but a very, very effective secret agent. The Frenchman is an aristocrat, right wing, looks very imposing, looks very handsome. Walked into a room, you'd immediately notice him, but actually psychologically very needy, very weak in his belief in himself, largely because he was pretty well rejected by his father, who was an admiral. And the third man, and this book is counterintuitive, the nicest man in the book is the Gestapo officer, who's a clever, loves France, speaks very good French, rather civilized man, and he never uses torture, never has people shot. But he persuades them, usually over dinner, to betray their country. Very clever man. So it's the way these 3 interplay over those 2 years in the context of occupied Europe.
And also some of the documents, actually, they were unseen for some years. So how did you get hold of them?
Well, you find them in strange places. The biggest and best source of all documents of this sort is actually the National Archives in Kew, which is a remarkable place, and we probably preserve our documents better than anywhere else in the world. These are documents which are held, personal files of the various agents involved, so you can find literally what was going on a day-to-day basis in many cases in the files in Kew. Then there's a lot more documents you can find in the local files in France, in les archives départementales, the local archives. And you find some in the National Archives. The French don't keep their archives quite so well. They're a bit chaotic. Sometimes, if it's really important things, you'll even find stuff in America, because in the United States, because the Americans captured a lot of the German archives. Not many German archives left. They're usually in either Moscow, Paris, or London. And for instance, I don't believe in writing up histories that are not accurate. I use the weather a lot here. If I want to find out what the weather was like on a certain day, I can do that by going to the British Meteorological Office in Exeter, who will provide me with the captured German weather maps. So I can be accurate about all of these things all the time.
And also, you went to the army yourself back in the 1960s, and then you went to different countries. But also, I reckon this is not your first book that you write about the Second World War. But are these books also some of your own reflections,
No,
like from
no.
your time in the army?
No, I was a Marine. No, there's a slight difference between the two.
Yeah.
We're not very kind of a difference. Silly, really. No, that you can never bring your own experiences into them because this is a story which is strictly confined to history. But what you do is view events through the prism of your own experiences. So when I was writing the book about the Royal Marines paddling up the Gironde in canoes in the dead of night, I know what they must have felt like because I've done that. When I was looking at the intelligence aspects of this, I know what that is like because I've been in that, I've worked in that area. So your own experiences give you a different perception and perhaps a greater degree of perception that you can then impart to the reader.
And now, just very brief about your time as the first leader of the Liberal Democrat, but very briefly. And you wrote in your diaries that it was very nerve-wracking to face Margaret Thatcher at PMQs on every Wednesday.
Listen, she was at the height of her powers. She was a very formidable lady. She was an exceptional Prime Minister in many ways. Not that I agree with everything she did. And I was new to the job and very inexperienced. And in fact, I was leader of my party after having only been in Parliament for 4 years, which is, I wasn't even a very experienced member of Parliament, and it was quite difficult. But, this is one of the things you have to do. But certainly, I regard one of the most frightening things I've ever had to do in my life, and I've done some little bit hair-raising things, was standing up in the House of Commons to be ritually handbagged by Mrs. Thatcher in front of the television cameras of the nation once a week.
I was with David Owen the other week, and he told me that actually Roy Jenkins' biggest mistake was to go and form a new party called Liberal Democrats, because for him it marked the end of social democracy in Britain. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree. David has a very sort of personal view of this. I think the bottom line was that there was nothing to choose between David Owen's politics and mine. Or Roy Jenkins, and I think when that happens, there's no earthly reason to divide you from those people who believe the same thing. And in many ways, the SDP was an exercise of egotism, I think, rather than an exercise of common sense. David Owen and I fought a furious battle as to which one of us would survive. That gives you the hint, that tells you the truth about the nature of the two parties, because if they both meant the same thing, why would only one of us survive? But he was determined to stay separate. I think that was a big mistake of his, but he views it differently, and I respect his opinion.
And also you were the former UK representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina.
International representative.
Yes,
yeah.
international representative. So how traumatizing was it for you to go through all those miserable times?
Well, I'm used to war. I've been through war. I've been. I know what it's like to fight as somebody on the front line, and so it's less traumatizing than most. But you never, ever become inured to the sight of women and children caught up in the battlefield, and so it was a very traumatizing, not traumatizing, but a very emotional experience to see that. And by the way, I take the view that unless you leave yourself open to those emotions, if you cover them over with a carapace of refusal to get emotionally involved, then you do a less good job, and you're certainly a less good human being. So that's just one of the things. Everybody goes through trauma in their lives, and that was a bit of mine.
And now, recently we hear about the Baltic states and the threat that it would come to those states with Trump's victory. So do you think, how threatened are they now?
Look, I don't think they're threatened necessarily, or very much, by Russian tanks. I don't think this happens like that. I think Mr. Trump does not have the same emotional commitment to NATO as his predecessors. I suspect in the end they will drag the words out of his mouth that he believes in NATO, but in his heart he doesn't. And when it comes to defence, it depends as much on the will as on the words. And I think his will is not there to do that. So I think the protection that we've had from NATO is because of his election much weaker. I suspect that Russia will not try and do anything overt in the Baltic states, but they will try, and they're very good at it, to use covert means and unofficial means to undermine, the encouragement of parties that are disruptive. A lot of evidence to say the Russians actually personally funded many of the anti-European right-wing parties in Europe because they want to see Europe break up. I think they'll use cyber attack. I think they'll use any means to undermine the security, threaten the security of the states, probably just short of open warfare.
Mm. And do you see a parallel between Brexit and Trump's victory?
I see a parallel as an illustration of a public mood, yeah. I'm writing my next book now, my 10th book. It'll be about the German opposition to Hitler, the opposition within Germany. It's an extraordinary story, by the way.
Yeah.
And I'm very struck by the similarities with the 1930s.
What will you call it?
I don't know yet.
Yes.
I don't know. I may just use the German word for resistance, Widerstand. Or I may use it, but I haven't. You've got a working title, but you haven't got a final title. And I'm very in the 1930s, and this does remind me enormously of the 1930s. We don't have a Hitler, we don't have somebody dying to go into war, but everything else is the same. A rejection of the establishment, a rejection of the political parties, a sense of revolt. Those who speak loudest and with the most ugly messages are the ones that are listened to. The small voice of rationality is not. Coming out of economic depression. And a huge drive away from multilateralism, from multilateral solutions, and towards unilateralism and isolationism. All of these things were very much a feature of the 30s, and they're very much a feature of today. And I think that the Trump election, whilst not connected formally in any other way, was nevertheless a very similar expression of a public revolt against the establishment as Brexit was. And we may well see that very soon we will begin to pay the price for that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, very soon. I think the autumn statement of yesterday is a very clear example of the economic price we're going to pay for Brexit, and I suspect it will not take long before the Americans realise that the political price, and maybe economic too, that they'll have to pay for Trump is quite high. So I'm not saying it'll go on, but it's certainly a danger for the moment.
But some people say that he's an Anglophile, and then he's going to bring back the Winston Churchill's bust, and then also he's...
I think he's a Trumpophile. I think he's a Trumpophile. I don't think he's an Anglophile in the slightest. I mean, look, does he take the white Anglo-Saxon view in America? Yeah, he probably does. But Mr. Trump, I mean, you only have to read what's on his baseball cap to know what comes first. America comes first. It's not Britain. And if he's going to bring Mr. Churchill's bust back, it's only because he regards himself as like Mr. Churchill. This is a piece of vanity, not a piece of political symbolism.
But also he was the first person to say, before Brexit, that actually Britain, they would go on the front of the queue and not at the back, unlike Mr. Obama. So.
Well, yes, I mean, maybe so, but I don't think he can actually do that. But he may try and do that. But, then what do we become? If it's the case that we part company with Europe, and it looks as though we are, then at an age when our security is weakened because NATO is weakened, if we leave Europe, we may get closer to the United States. But I think what Mr. Trump has in mind is that we become, a sort of British satellite to the United States of America. I'm not sure that's what I think is a good idea.
Two final questions. On Brexit, your party leader, he said it in all honest terms that he wants to see a second referendum, so as Nick Clegg. So, and some people they called it to overturn, this act will overturn the will of the British people.
It's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. The British people have voted for a departure, but they haven't voted for a destination. Indeed, those who argued out very specifically and very deliberately did not say what model they wanted to go to. And the consequence is that there's a huge range of damage and danger. If we have a hard Brexit, there will be a very serious damage, I think, to this country's standing in the world. It's not insignificant that when an American president comes to Europe, he no longer comes to London, he goes to Berlin. We have already been diminished in our standing, not least amongst our allies. And in terms of jobs, if we go to a hard Brexit, we will be in a much more difficult position. This will have a profound impact on the British people. If we go to a soft Brexit, we remain a member of the single market, we'll have to accept a degree of immigration, but the consequence in the future for us, I think, will be much easier. Now, there's a huge range of difference between those two. The British people decided to go, but they are also entitled, it seems to me, to decide what kind of out it's going to be. And what began with a democratic act, the wish of the British people for Brexit, I argued against, of course, should not end with a private stitch-up by the government in which the British people have no voice.
Well, also yesterday in Chancellor's budget was that the forecasts are still very high, actually unlike the previous forecast before the referendum, that the consumption would go down, and then now we're seeing a very high consumption.
Well, I don't think the consumption thing is the key thing. I mean, it may well be that what we're seeing at present with the pound low is a bit of a splurge before prices rise. It may well be that you're seeing a bit of a splurge before Christmas. But look, the fundamental figure that really we should cause me to worry us is that according to the OBR proposal, according to the OBR estimates, exactly by the way as the Treasury said before Brexit, the British economy will be 2.5%. That's £13 trillion pounds smaller as a result of Brexit in the next 3 or 4 years than it would otherwise have been if we stayed in. Now that's a tremendous cutback in people's jobs and prosperity of the nation, etc. That's the fundamental fact. Now they may be wrong, but the Treasury said that before the election. They were called scaremongers. The OBR independently confirmed that yesterday. We've got to conclude that that may well be right, and if it is right, the cost of Brexit will be very, very big indeed, just as we said it would be.
So if the Article 50 amendment comes to the Lords, would you try to block it and vote against it?
We wouldn't. No. The Article 50 amendment, we will say this must be given debate. This is what the British people want. We will then say, we'll move an amendment and say, yes, we accept the British people have decided out, but they should have a say in what kind of out it's going to be. Is it going to be a hard Brexit? Is it going to be a soft Brexit? If the government won't grant that, of course we would vote against it, yeah. Of course we would.
And final question. You've been in politics for over last 55 years, half a century.
A little bit less, but 30 years anyway.
Yeah, 30 years, sweet 30 years. So what would you like to be remembered for? I don't remember when I asked Mike Hessen that question, he said that most of the time, people, they don't get remembered.
Well, I don't know if people get remembered or not, but if they did, I would, the one word I'd want on my tombstone is my proudest at the moment, which is to be a member of Parliament of my constituency down in Yeovil and Somerset. That remains what I came into politics for. That remains the thing I've done that I think I'm proudest of than anything else, insofar as you're entitled to be proud, and maybe it's not a very good emotion to have. And I think that of all the things that I've done in my life, that's the most important.
We shall wait and see. Thank you
Nice
very
to see
much.
you. Good luck and thanks for coming round. You've been getting round. You really have.
Yeah.
You've seen Michael and you've seen David. How